So in the last class, we basically discussed about the HRMS integration part, that identity classes has basically three different set of employees. We named it as internal employees, where the employee type is employee. The second type of employees are contractors, and the third type of employee were our vendors. Now these employees were managed via the HRMS system. These employees were managed by the HRMS system. So for employee management, we have a employee HRMS system. For contractor management, we have a contractor HRMS system. Similarly, for vendor, we have vendor HRMS system. So for different type of employees, we have different type of HRMS system. So in this organization, we have multiple HRMS system. So this is also possible. An organization may have multiple HRMS system in place. Now, we have seen in the last class that how we can basically create the user by the functionality of uploading. We basically uploaded the user in the last session. So today we are going to extend the use case scenario. Now during this use case scenario, what business is saying? Business is saying, okay boss, employee HRMS system will provide you a CSV file. They will basically place this CSV file in the server. They will place this CSV file in the server. Now it's the job of Saviynt to pick up this file from the server and perform the operations on user, either creating a user or modifying the user or terminating the user. So it's the job of Saviynt to do a pickup of this particular file from the server and then do the necessary things. Similarly, for contractor HRMS system also, they are basically planning to place this CSV. CSV means a comma separated value file where all the employee records will be placed. They will place this CSV file over to the server. And then from the server, it's the job of Saviynt which will pick up this file and will perform the operations. Okay. Now they have basically shared the similar CSV format that we have seen last day. But for contractor, they have a special kind of CSV file. So we'll go through both the CSV files, that what kind of files they are now providing to us. But before we move into that kind of things, that how to perform this kind of integration and all, let's talk a little bit about JSON. Let's talk a little bit about JSON. So JSON basically stands for JavaScript Object Notation. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. JSON is basically a text format for storing and transporting data. So JSON is nothing but a text format, some kind of text, which will help us to store and transport data. We are basically storing and transporting the data to other servers or over the HTTP network. Now, let me just show you a very small JSON string, that how JSON looks like. Let's say JSON basically looks like this. JSON basically looks like this. This entire thing from here to here, this is basically a JSON text which is representing our data, which is basically representing our data. What kind of data it is representing? It is saying that, okay, boss, name equal to John, age equal to 30, and DOB equal to this. DOB equal to this particular date. So JSON, basically in this example, it is defining a object. This entire string is an object with three different properties: name, age, and date of birth. So JSON is basically a lightweight data interchange format. Means with it's a very lightweight. In the text format, it is basically it has the syntax in a very easier understandable text format, and it is used to basically send the data from one system to another system, for transporting from one place to another place, or for storing the data in the own system. So JSON, why we are trying to learn about JSON? The main reason is JSON is widely used whenever you come across this thing, REST API. Now, what is REST API? The parent of REST API is basically web services. Web services are basically developed in early 2000, when there was a need of sending the messages from one place to another place over the HTTP network. So there were two different two different type of REST services. The first category of REST services were SOAP based, and the second category is REST based. Okay. Now this REST based API widely using this JSON format for sending the data or for storing the data from one place to another place. That's why we are going through a little bit, getting some little bit idea about JSON. JSON is a language independent. JSON is a language independent. Okay, so there is no language required at all. There is no dependency that you have to use JSON only in Java or JSON only in Python. No, it is completely language independent. Now, when you write or when you build up a JSON string, you have to follow basically couple of syntax. The syntax is basically the data, whatever the data that you wanted to store should be in name value pair. The data that you wanted to store should be in name value pair. Name, and the name must have a value. It should be in this particular format. So this is the first syntax. Second syntax is saying data is separated by a comma. So for two different data, you should have a comma. Name 1, value 1. It should be separated by a comma. Then the third syntax is saying curly braces hold an object. If you have a curly braces in place, it should basically hold an object. It is basically holding a object. Square bracket. You will see that we have something called square bracket as well. Square bracket basically hold an array. Hold an array. Let's take an example of each of them. Let's take an example of each of them. Before we take an example, let me just tell you a couple of things. JSON, whatever the value that you are going to store, it should basically, JSON doesn't able to store all the data types. Okay, so it basically store couple of data types only. For example, you might be aware about data types, right? That what kind of data you are trying to store. A data type may be a string, maybe boolean, maybe some date time, maybe some float, maybe some double, maybe some other types, right? So JSON is only capable of storing these data types. JSON can store a string, It can store a string. It can store a number. It can store an object. It can store an array. It can store a Boolean value, or it can store a null value. Null means void. So it only supports these data type. It doesn't support any function. It doesn't support any date time format. Okay, so it only support these data types. So you have to remember this thing, that JSON only supports these data types. Now let's take a very small example. When you wanted to define a JSON string, it should basically look like something similar to this. Let me just select a different color. Yeah. So if you wanted to define a JSON string, it should basically look like this. You start with a curly braces, name, double quote, Amit. So a JSON string will look like this for a string data type name, and name is basically of type string. So double quote Amit. So you have to mention a double quote whenever you are defining a string variable. Similarly, if I go for a number, it should basically look like age. You don't have to give any double quote at all because this is a number. If you wanted to define an object, for example, if you wanted to define a object, let's say I wanted to define a person object. Let's say I wanted to define a person object. It should basically look like this. I wanted to define a person object. Name, let's say Amit, comma, age, let's say 30, comma, DOB, let's say so this is a JSON object. What is the object name? Object name is person. And for the person object, what are all the data that we are storing? We are storing name, Amit, age, 30, and DOB is 1st of April 1990. So this is how we are going to denote a object in JSON. This is how we are going to denote a object in JSON. Now, if you wanted to denote a array, if you wanted to denote a array inside JSON, then how we are going to denote or define an array inside JSON? In order to define an array inside JSON, what we need to do, let's say I wanted to define an array of names of employee, array of name of employee. So it start with this, let's say employee names. I wanted to define an array of name of employees. So array should start with a square bracket, then enter the values. Let's say John, James, Jeff. This is how an array of names, employee names, can be defined. Okay, so in order to define an array, what we need to do? We need to basically put a square bracket that here, okay, employee name is an array of employees which contains three different values: John, James, and Jeff. So this is how this is defined. Now, if you wanted to define a Boolean, it's very much easy. So in order to define a Boolean, let's say cell true or false. Okay, we can mention two values in Boolean, either true or false. So cell can be a true value, cell can be a false value. So this is how the different data types are defined inside JSON. Okay, why we are learning it? Because Saviynt created a lot of web services for each and every operation, and these web services are developed in REST API, which basically consume the data in the format of JSON. So it's very much important for us to be aware about the basic stuffs related to JSON. Okay, that's why we are going through the basic stuffs related to JSON, that how it looks like and all those stuffs. Now let's say the last thing, that how you are defining a null value. Let's say some person has a middle name as null. So if you wanted to define that as null, it's very much simple. Let's say middle name mn null. Just write it null. So this is how you are going to define a null value. So we can have string, number, object, array, boolean, null. Okay, so how you define the object, that was a little bit tricky. That okay, the name of the object is person, and inside that person object we have various. You can see we again started with the curly braces because the object start with the curly braces, and then the name value pair. Okay, so for array, remember square bracket. Okay, so that's a kind of a little bit basics related to JSON, that how JSON looks like, what is the format of the JSON and all those things. Now let's move into the use case scenario that we were discussing about. So we were discussing about that, okay, the HRMS, the employee HRMS and the contractor HRMS will now provide us a CSV file. They will place the CSV file in the server, and now it's the Saviynt developer's job to build up some logic which will basically pick up the which will basically pick up the file from the server, and then will process the file, and then will move the file to another location depending upon success or failure of the job, that whether the file was properly processed or whether it encounters some error while processing the file. Up to this part, anyone, any question?
No.
Okay, now going to the next part. So they also provided us the sample CSV file. So let me quickly open that. Before that, let me start up the virtual machine. I believe it started up. Let's connect with the system. So we connected with the system. So what they have given us, they has given us the format of the CSV file. The CSV file format looks like this. You have the username, first name, last name, manager, display name, email, department name, region, location, status key, cost center, and employee type. They have given us this CSV format. Let me paste it somewhere over here. Okay, let me paste the CSV format somewhere here. So this is the CSV format that they have given us. Okay, now if you look closely to this CSV format, whenever we come across this kind of situation in Saviynt that we have to basically import the users to the Saviynt system, this CSV format header names, okay, whatever the column names which you are mentioning over here, these column names must match with the database column names. Okay, the column names which you are seeing over here, these column names must match with our database column name. That's the first thing that you have to make sure that, okay, CSV file column names match with DB column name. The second thing, they mentioned that, okay, the status key value, the status key value, the status key is basically the attribute which denotes whether this particular record is active or inactive. So what they mentioned, the HRMS system or the HRMS guys, they mentioned we will pass either the value 1 or the string active for a active record. For a active record, either will pass the value 1 or active. And for a disabled user or terminated user, they will either pass it as 0 or inactive. So they mentioned this part as well, that they will either pass the data as 1 active or 0 inactive. For inactive record, they will pass this, and for active record, they will pass this kind of thing. So there can be a two values. Sometimes they may pass only one, or sometimes they pass active. So that's the second thing they mentioned. The contractor management system says that, okay, boss, whatever the HRMS CSV file looks like, similar to that, they will also send, but for the contractor management system, they have one additional parameter called termination date. They want that for each and every contractor, a termination date value must be populated during the time of creation. Okay, that a termination date value must be populated during the time of creation. So for the contractors, they have this CSV format. For employees, they have only this CSV format. Okay, one additional column will get added for the contractor. Now inside Saviynt, in order to achieve these kind of things, we have to basically perform two steps. In this example, we have to perform two steps. And these two steps are very much important. So whenever you come across this kind of requirement, we have to basically go through couple of syntax or the rule of performing these kind of things. So there are a couple of rules that you need to be aware of, that okay, if you come across this particular thing, you have to follow this kind of process. So the first thing which Saviynt says that, okay, whenever you come across this kind of situation where you are receiving the files and all, so they have something called data files folder. They have something called data files folder. If you see, I have also created a data files folder over here as well. If I go to CD Saviynt, inside Saviynt, you will see I have created various folders: app onboarding, bundles, import. These three folders are very much important. Okay, if you go inside the import, you can see we have folder called data files, fail, process, SAV, success. So there are 5 different folders which are placed inside the import. Now how Saviynt know, okay, these things are there and we have to utilize that? For that, we have a configuration file that we have configured. So let me quickly open the configuration file. So all the configuration files were placed inside the conf folder. We also set up a variable as Saviynt home that is basically pointing to this corner folder. Now, if I open the config folder, config.groovy file. So config.groovy file basically contains the log locations and all that we discussed, that okay, the log locations and the parameters related to whether you have to use the security, what kind of security you wanted to use, all those things are configured from config folder. If you go inside the folder named external config.properties, if I open this file, this contains basically various details. You can see we have couple of details that we have written up over here. Now, if you see, we have mentioned that, okay, the job ECM import file extension. Okay, so if you are importing couple of things, what should be the extension it is going to take? By default, it will assume the extension should be .csv. Then the save file location. SAP file location is basically, what is a SAP file path? SAP files are basically the configuration related files, or you can assume it as a schema file, that how the CSV structure should look like. We should have a schema file, and schema file should be stored in the location home identity classes Saviynt import SAP. Inside SAP, you must have all the schema files. The data files should be placed inside this data files folder. All the import process, that the files which are currently in progress or being processed, those things are inside the process folder. If you see that, okay, if the things have been properly done, it will move inside the success folder, or it will move inside the failure folder. Similar to that, we have app onboarding related stuff. So first, concentrate on this first part, first configuration details related to files. Okay, so we mentioned couple of path. So we have mentioned that, okay, all the schema files should be stored in this location, and all the import files should be stored in this data files folder. So the HR has basically provided us the CSV file. We have to basically make sure that HR should push all the HR should place all the data files in the data files folder. So they mentioned the CSV and all. Definitely what kind of CSV they will pass. So we just now seen the CSV structure, that the header will look like this. So we need to create a SAP file. We need to create a SAP file. SAP file will basically contain the schema information, that how the CSV looks like. It contains the schema information. So let's do create a SAP file. Now for creating a SAP file, you have to follow a convention. You have to follow a convention, and you need to remember this convention. Okay, the SAP file name, whatever you are going to create, the structure of the SAP file name should be like this: name underscore, okay, DB table name dot SAP. That should be the entire name of the SAP file. You have to mention the DB table name. If you are trying to import the users, the DB table name for the users table should be mentioned over here. If you are trying to import, let's say, account, the DB table name corresponding to account should be mentioned over here. So inside Saviynt, the DB table name for the users is basically users. So the SAP file name would be something like, let's say I can give a name something like contractor underscore users dot sap. For employee file, I will create employee underscore users dot sap. So this kind of notation we need to follow while creating the files. Okay, so let's now create this file, contractors users dot sap. So this file must be created inside the location of sap. So let me go inside import. We have sap folder. Here I need to create that. So let's create it. So vi, let me first create employee one, employee underscore users.sav. So it follow the entire structure that how the thing should looks like and all. Okay, so let's provide the details over here that how the thing should looks like, what do you want to do with the data and all those stuffs. So the line should start with a hash. Okay, for the users, don't assume it as a comment. Okay, because most of the programming language hash is used for commenting that line, but for this SAP file, hash is not used for commenting. Hash is used for taking the line into the consideration for the user schema. Okay, so don't get confused with that normal conventions and all. Okay guys, so what we need to do, we need to basically prepare this SAV file. So the first line that I'm going to write up over here, that what action the system should take if the user is not present in the file. For example, let's say they are not sending us the full dump of the user. In that case, what you need to do? For example, let's say there are thousands of users inside Saviynt, and in the flat file, you are only getting 5. So whatever the 995 users which are not there in the file, what you need to do with those users? So generally, we don't want to take any action. So let's define that okay, if user not in file, user not in file. If the user is not in file, what action that we wanted to take? Let's say I wanted to take no action. User not in file action equal to no action. Then what is the file name? What is the file name that should be placed by the HR? So the file name is going to be, let's say this is, I'm going to prepare it for employee. So employee schema user dot, so they will place the file as employee schema user dot csv. So dot csv is not required to mention over here, so I'm just giving the file name, and this file name must be present in the data files. Okay, because all the files should be placed in the data files location. Then the third line, so we mentioned the file name, we mentioned the user not in file action. Then what is the delimiter used in the file? Delimiter, delimiter. Delimiter that is going to be used in the file is comma. Then how many lines you wanted to skip from the main file, that is employee schema? So we know that the first line is the header, so I wanted to skip that. So skip number of lines. Skip number of lines equal to 1. Then whether you want to perform the 0-day provisioning or not. So we don't want to perform any 0-day provisioning. 0-day provisioning equal to false. We don't want to perform any 0-day provisioning. What is this 0-day provisioning? We'll come across this point in later. Now what is the reconciliation field? User reconciliation. User reconciliation field is basically the attribute that is going to help Saviynt to determine whether the row of data which is coming for the processing, whether that particular user exists inside the system or not. So what is the common parameter? So the common parameter that we are going to use here is username. That okay, if the row of data that is being processed or currently in process, what is the username? If that username is matched with Saviynt user, then it's a match, and Saviynt will then perform a update operation on those sets of user rather than creating that. So user reconciliation field, I'm going to mention it as username. Then whether you wanted to generate the system username or not. So yes, we wanted to generate it. So generate system generate system username equal to true. Yes, this SAP file is case sensitive. Okay. So whatever the things that we are mentioning, you have to mention in the same way or in the similar way. Okay. Then talking about whether you wanted to generate the email or not. So let's say generate email. So yes, I wanted to generate the email as well. So I set it as true. So generate email, generate system name, system username. Both parameters have been set as true. Then we have, do you wanted to check rules or not? Check rules. What are rules and all? We'll discuss about rules in the earlier session. So I don't wanted to check the rules. So that's why I set it as false. Then the next thing comes over here, that is status key JSON. Status key JSON. Status key JSON equal to. Now we need to basically pass a JSON value. So if you see the requirement of the HRMS, so what HRMS said that okay, status key can contains two value for the active. If the user is active, the value may be 1 or active, or maybe 0 or inactive for an inactive employee. So we need to construct the JSON for this as well. Now, so how the JSON will look like? JSON will look like this. Status active. If the user status is active, then what are all the possible values that are possible? 1 or active. Okay. So there are two values. So where do you want to store these two values? This should be stored in a array. So I'm going to store inside a array. That's why a square bracket. I need to mention over here, if it is array, I need to mention over here that how it looks like. So the value should be either 1 or value should be either active. Square bracket closed. Then a comma. The second value that we wanted to pass is status inactive. Again, this is a array 0 or inactive. That's it. So you need to basically mention the things over here. Now, whether this format that you're mentioning is correct or not, for that we have a very good website, okay, that will help you to JSON formatter. Go to this particular website and pass your JSON data. Pass your JSON data. So what we need to pass, so let me just, so these things will start with a curly braces, right? Then we have the value status active, status active. It should be a square bracket, either 1 or active. If you wanted to add some other string as well, let's say if it is true, I assume that okay, it is also active users. Now for status inactive, we should have the value again 0 or inactive, or let's say false. So if you simply try to format this process, it will basically check two things, whether it's the valid JSON format or not. You can see it's a valid as per the RFC 8259. This is valid, and you can simply copy it and you can paste that data over there. So I just passed the JSON data, that okay, my JSON will look like this, JSON equal to this. Either you can mention it like this, or you can place entire string in one single line. Let me just place it in one single line itself. So whatever the things that we have mentioned, let me copy it. So that thing was very much helpful in order to see whether the JSON format that you are mentioning is correct or not. So we have mentioned check rules. Now we need to mention this one, status key JSON. So let me just write it again. Status key JSON equal to, I mentioned the status key JSON, that my status key JSON will look like this. Now the next thing that you need to mention what are all the columns or the header format look like for this file. So my employee schema user header format will look like this, as we have already copied up. So it basically looks like this. So let me quickly copy it. Let me paste it. It should look like username, first name, last name, manager, display name, email, department name, region, location, status key, cost center, and employee type. Let me save it. So this file is basically for my employee. Similarly, I will do the things for my contractor as well. So let me simply copy it to a new file, contractors, contractor users.sav. So for the contractor, they have one unique requirement or one extra field they are going to send, and that extra field is basically my termination date. So term date, they wanted to pass this data as well. And the file name for this one is going to be my contractor. So let me just change the file name, contractor schema user. Let me save and quit. So we have the schema or the configuration file for both the two things are in place, employee and contractor. Now we have to basically pass the data file, how the HRMS should pass the data. So let me copy one row of data that we have already used in past. So this is a sample row of data that I am going to use for my employee. So this is my employee, it's employee. So this is going to be for my employee. Let me check whether this particular user exists in the system or not before we do anything. 192.168.244.105. No, it is 192.168.112. This is my server. Let me log in it. If I go to my admin tab, if I go to users, let me search with this particular username. No, there is no user exists with this name. Even if I go with 45, no. So let me just create these two users. So first I am going to copy this entire line. Let me create a file in the data files folder. Vi employee schema user.csv. So my employee file look like this: username, first name, last name, manager, display name, email. I am keeping it as blank. So I want to see whether the system is automatically assigning the email for this one or not. It should generate the email as per the rule that we have defined in our last class. That email should be the system username @identityclasses.com. Then finance, the department, then we have the location, status key is active, then cost center, and then employee type. Let me quickly save and quit. Similarly, let me just define, let me copy it to contractor schema user.csv. So vi contractor, for this one they will pass additional data, right? The additional column name is termination date. So let me pass it. So first the employee type should be contractor and the termination date. So the termination date that they would like to pass over here is, let's say 15th of May 2022 at 9 p.m. So 15th of May 2022 space, it should be in UTC format at 9 p.m. HHMMSS. So this should be the entire date format. Okay, so we mentioned the date over here as well. Now let me just modify this username to 45. This is, instead of James, this is Tom Sandy. He's also going to work in finance. The manager of both the persons remains same. So that's it for this user as well. So let me save and quit. So we basically created two records, 45 and 46, one employee and one contractor. You can see we have one employee and one contractor. We have this record also came into picture. Let me delete this. This is not at all required by us. So we have only contractor schema user and employee schema user. Now in order to fetch the data from this particular location, and in order to make sure, okay, that those schema files should be considered, for that we need to basically run a job. We need to run a schema job. That schema job will pick up the schema file. From the schema file, it will detect, okay, in the data files whether that particular file name exists or not. If yes, it will start processing based on the schema file. The job name is this one. You need to go to job control panel, go to schema. There you will be able to see flat file based user import schedule job. You need to simply run this job. Click on add job. Let me give the name as user import. HRMS user import, let's say HRMS user import. Let me submit it. Now you will be able to see the name of the job. Now ideally organization will basically put it a scheduler that, okay, this particular thing should run on every day at this time. So you can basically schedule the time that run every, so we basically want to run it every in an organization. They used to run these kind of jobs every 4 hours, and they can set the time as well, that okay, what should be the time. Let me submit. So I basically make this job as scheduled job. Okay, every day it will run in an interval of 4 hours. Okay, now let me just try to trigger the job right now for us, and let me go to the logs folder. So the logs folder location is this: home, identity classes, Saviynt, conf logs. Just run tail -f star. Let it run. If I click on this, so we have the schema job that we ran just now. You can see this is currently in running mode. This is doing the things for you. So it will take couple of seconds. So it's still running. You can see it is checking. Number of records in the feed 1, active users not in feed 0, number of users inserted 1, number of users updated 0. So kind of that entire details are mentioned over here. So it's still running. Let it complete. Yeah, you can see the job got finished. So the files contractor schema user has been moved to success. Similarly, the file for the employee schema user must be also moved to success. So let's see whether those users has been created or not. So the user login that we have mentioned, first see whether the files had been moved to success directory or not. So the location is import / import data files. Inside import, we have success folder. You can see we have contractors and HRMS. Both the files has been moved to success folder. Success folder, it has been moved because the file has been properly processed. Let me copy the employee ID. One is 46 and the other one is 45. Let me just cross verify the things whether the users got created or not. You can see the first user is this, James Sandy got created and the email ID also assigned to him. This user is active. All the details are properly populated as per our requirement. It is an employee. She is the manager of this user. Now this employee doesn't have any termination date because we didn't set up any termination date for this. If you scroll down, you will be able to see that, okay, there is no termination date. Now, if I go for the other user, that is the ID will end with 45, that is Tom. You can see this user is also active. All the details are properly propagated. It should also have the date, termination date that we have set 15th of May 2022. If you go into the database table for this user, you will be able to see exact timestamp. So let me copy it and let me connect with Workbench. Let me connect with the server. So it is 112.101. Let me connect. Okay. Now the users details are present in the users table. So that's it. Where username equal to, let me fire the query. So this is the user record. If you scroll down to here, you'll be able to see somewhere around termination date that we have set 15th of May 2022 and time is 9 p.m. that we have set. Okay, the system username also got generated tom.sandy as per our logic. Okay, so right now we have seen, okay, how to basically import the users, how to integrate the HRMS system with Saviynt Security Manager.